Welcome everyone to the latest episode of our podcast, Driving Eco-Sustainability, My Perspective, and I am your host, Grace. Today, we are going to be doing something completely different, something more interesting. We are going to be delving more and talking about those unique terms, the jargon you always hear in this space about climate change. You always move out there, we all attend conferences, and there are those terms you always hear people talking about. And you're always wondering, or you're afraid of asking, what does this mean? So today, we are going to be delving more into that. I will be sharing with you a few nuggets of what you can learn about them, and you can also be able to pick up one or two things so that you can explore this further. So today, we are going to be talking about the UNFCCC, or known as UNFCCC. See 3 times. So what is it basically? We always go out there and you hear someone saying UNFCCC, UNFCCC that. Now UNFCCC in full is the United Nations Convention Framework on Climate Change. What is this about? This is a foundational international agreement on the regulation of environment matters and climate change. And for the longest time, ever since it came into force and when it was adopted, it has provided the foundational guidance on climate change negotiations, international, multilateral, regional, or even national negotiations in this space. Now, the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Convention Framework on Climate Change, it was adopted in May 1992 in New York, USA. 154 countries signed the agreement when it was opened for signature at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992. And when it existed, the requisite number of ratification signatures required, which was 50 in number, by the way, it entered into force on the 21st day of March 1994. Now you are wondering, what is the main aim of this agreement? Why was it signed? Why have all these countries ended up endorsing this agreement and ratifying it? The main aim of the agreement was to oblige countries to reduce their greenhouse gases emission arising from dangerous human-induced interference with the climate system. Now, these activities are quite broad in number. It may be deforestation. This is cutting down trees. It may be use of fossil fuels. These are usually petrol, natural gas, coal. Now, you will realize that before the agreement was adopted, the discussion was mainly restricted to global warming. But post-adoption of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it mainstreamed the discussions of climate change on the international space. Now, the priority areas that were focused on in the agreement were 6 in number. These were education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, and international cooperation. So how would the parties achieve the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions? The main way in which parties would achieve this was through the common but differentiated responsibilities in line with their respective capacities. What does this mean? This is where countries are recognized to have different capabilities and responsibilities to address climate change. Developed countries, which is the global north, have traditionally been known to be the main emitters of greenhouse gases. Now, developed countries were expected and obliged by the convention to take lead in addressing climate change by committing to reduce their emissions and to also assist developing countries to address the climate change crisis through financial assistance and technological transfer. And because of this, the agreement classified countries into different annexes. And these annexes that are at the back of the convention detail the different classes within which the countries fell into. And these classes came with particular responsibilities and obligations upon becoming a party to the convention. Now, Annex 1. This one has industrialized countries, undeveloped countries, and economies in transition. When I talk about industrialized countries and developed countries by this time in 1992, would be looking at countries like the UK, the USA, Netherlands, Germany, such countries. And the economies in transition, these were mainly countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union that had been disintegrated and were now establishing themselves. These countries in Annex 1, what was expected of them? These countries were expected to adopt national policies and measures to mitigate climate change by reducing emissions from human activities and enhancing greenhouse sinks and reservoirs. What are greenhouse sinks and reservoirs? This involves planting of trees. These are activities that help in absorbing and reserving carbon dioxide, which is the leading greenhouse gas out here. So these countries were expected to mitigate climate change by enhancing the creation of greenhouse sinks and or reservoirs, like planting trees, like conserving wetlands, like protecting our oceans. And one other obligation they had was to offer assistance to other parties to achieve the objective of the convention. This is the developing countries or the least developed countries at that time. Now, Annex 2, this annex had countries that were member states of the organization of the OECD and members of the EU. Now, some members that are listed in Annex 1 among the developed countries and among the developed countries or already industrialized nations at this time were also listed in Annex 2. Now, these countries are required to provide new and additional financial support to facilitate the transfer of or access to green technologies to developing countries so that they can help them in reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt and mitigate climate change. Now, all the countries that were not in Annex 1 or Annex 2, these were known as non-Annex 1 parties. These are mainly the least developed countries, mainly in Africa, or even small island states. Now, a member can apply to become an Annex 1 country upon being sufficiently developed. Now, how do the parties meet their obligations? Parties meet their obligations through organizing and meeting at the annual conference of parties, or usually commonly known as COP. What is COP? COP is the supreme body that governs climate change negotiations. And this body was established in the United Nations Convention Framework of Climate Change, and it was also further concretized in the Paris Agreement. The first conference was convened in Berlin, Germany, from March 28th to April 7th, 1995. The COP works with other subsidiary bodies, like the Subsidiary Body on Scientific and Technological Advice, or commonly known as SBSTA. This one provides timely information and advice on scientific and technological matters relating to the convention. The Subsidiary Body of Implementation, which is the other body, assists the COP in reviewing of the implementation of the convention. And these bodies sit at the Secretariat, which is found in Bonn, Germany. And it facilitates and oversees the COP sessions. And Bonn is, of course, the headquarters of these subsidiary bodies. And SBI, or the Subsidiary Body on Implementation, usually holds Bonn climate meetings, which are 2 sessions. One that happens in June and another that happens in November. They usually set the agenda for the upcoming COP. As we know, COP usually happens at the end of November and early December. Now, what are the key successes of the UNFCCC? One, UNFCCC has been credited, as I earlier mentioned, for streamlining global cooperation and awareness on climate change. And also, this framework convention birthed the Kyoto Protocol, which we are going to discuss later, and the Paris Agreement, which set the new climatic temperature goal, which we are going to discuss in our next series. And what are some of the weaknesses that have been brought forward as some of those issues that were not fully addressed or where the UNFCCC has failed. One of the issues that has come up, that happens and is still happening and dominating discussions in international climate change negotiations is limited access to financing for adaptation and mitigation initiatives, especially for the developing countries. Also, the common but differentiated responsibilities was also criticized because most of the parties felt that it was not backed by research or science, and also most parties felt that tasking the developed countries to assist and work with the developing nations without giving the developing nations obligations under the Framework Convention was a bit unfair. So currently, the UNFCCC has 198 signatories, and with various negotiation groups that include the small island states, the African Group of Negotiators, which is AGN, the LDCs, the G77 and China, EU, and specifically my country, Uganda, ratified the convention on 13th March 1993 and officially domesticated it as part of our national laws and policy upon enactment of our National Climate Change Act. Are you wondering how this convention can assist you to undertake climate action? Remember the 6 priority areas that I mentioned earlier as highlighted. You can undertake public awareness, cooperation. Therefore, if you want to learn more about the UNFCCC, you can visit their official website, which I have added to the description. Thank you.